On September 5th, 2008, at exactly 3:15 in the morning, a university student sat alone in her apartment, textbooks spread across her desk, preparing for an exam that would never come. What happened in the next 17 minutes would shake an entire community to its core and expose failures in our justice system that continue to haunt us today. This is a story about brilliance destroyed, about a system that failed, and about evil that defied every boundary of human comprehension. Eve Carson was not just any student. At 22 years old, she served as student body president of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, one of the nation's most prestigious universities. She was a pre-medicine major with a near-perfect grade point average, a young woman who volunteered at homeless shelters, mentored underprivileged children, and somehow still found time to make every person she met feel valued and seen. Her professors described her as once in a generation. Her friends called her a light. Her family knew her as their everything. That night, while most of her campus slept, Eve sat in her off-campus apartment on Friendly Lane, a street whose name would soon carry unbearable irony. She had an organic chemistry exam the following morning. Friends would later recall that she sent text messages around 2:45 a.m., confirming study group plans for later that week. She was alive, focused, full of plans for a future that stretched bright and endless before her. 17 minutes later, everything changed. The windows of her apartment glowed softly in the darkness, curtains open, as they often were. Eve never thought to close them. Why would she? This was Chapel Hill, a college town where students walked freely at night, where the biggest concerns were midterms and basketball games. But someone was watching. In the shadows outside, two figures observed her through those uncovered windows, studying her routine, waiting for their moment. At 3:02 a.m., Eve's roommate was away for the night. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of pages turning, the scratch of pen on paper. The front door had a screen door that latched, but the main door behind it stood open to let in the cool September air. This detail, this single choice made in innocence, would become the entry point for monsters. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station, recovered days later, would show two individuals purchasing cigarettes and energy drinks at 2:57 a.m. They were less than a quarter mile from Eve's apartment. By 3:04, they were at her door. What happened next comes from forensic evidence, from the crime scene itself, and from confessions that would eventually emerge, though even those confessions cannot fully explain the depths of what occurred. The two men entered through that screen door without force, without breaking anything. They simply walked in. Eve looked up from her desk to find herself facing armed intruders in her own home, in the space where she should have been safest. One held a handgun. The other carried a knife. Both had extensive criminal records. Both had been released early from previous sentences. Both should never have been free. The first demand was simple: money. Eve told them the truth. She was a college student. She had almost nothing. Her wallet contained $11. Her apartment held a laptop, a television, some textbooks, nothing of significant value. But these men had not come just for robbery. The evidence would later reveal something far more disturbing. They had watched her. They had chosen her. And they had decided she would not survive this encounter. For reasons that defy human logic, for motivations that make no rational sense, they forced Eve at gunpoint into her own vehicle, a light blue Toyota Highlander. Witnesses in neighboring apartments heard nothing, saw nothing. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, Eve Carson was already gone, driven away from her home in her own car by the very people who had invaded her life. Over the next 4 hours, those men drove Eve across Chapel Hill and into Durham. Security cameras captured the Toyota at multiple locations. An ATM camera recorded one of the perpetrators attempting to use Eve's debit card at 3:47 a.m. The transaction was declined. Eve had $30 in her account. That was all. $30 and $11 in cash. $41 total. Remember that number, $41. Phone records show that Eve's cell phone was active during this time, moving between cell towers, creating a digital trail of her final hours. Investigators would later piece together that journey, minute by minute, following her last moments across 2 counties. What they discovered in those records, in those movements, painted a picture of prolonged terror that no human being should ever endure. At approximately 5:26 a.m., as the first light of dawn began to break over Chapel Hill, a resident in a quiet neighborhood heard gunshots. 5 distinct shots, close together, then silence. The witness looked outside but saw nothing unusual. Dawn was breaking. Morning was coming. Somewhere nearby, Eve Carson's life was ending. Her body was discovered hours later by a resident walking their dog on the edge of a residential area, lying in the street. She had been shot 5 times. The medical examiner's report, which I will not detail out of respect for her family, confirmed what investigators already suspected. This had been execution. This had been murder of the most brutal, most senseless kind. And the evidence suggested something that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened detectives on the case. According to later testimony, in those final moments, as Eve faced her killers, knowing what was about to happen, she asked them to pray with her. A young woman, 22 years old, student body president, future doctor, volunteered at shelters, mentored children, asked the men who were about to murder her if they would pray with her before they took her life. They refused. Then they shot her 5 times for $41. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed. The Toyota Highlander was found abandoned. Inside, investigators recovered fingerprints, DNA evidence, shell casings. Surveillance footage from the ATM showed a clear image of one suspect. Within 72 hours, police had identified both perpetrators. Within a week, both were in custody. The evidence against them was overwhelming, undeniable, absolute. The first suspect was 17 years old at the time of the murder. Despite his age, he had already accumulated a criminal record that spanned pages: breaking and entering, assault, robbery. He had been in and out of juvenile detention, released early, given chance after chance by a system designed to rehabilitate. The second suspect was 21. His record was even more extensive: armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon. He had been released on parole just months before Eve's murder, despite objections from the district attorney who prosecuted his previous case. Here is where the story moves from tragedy to systemic failure. Both of these individuals were known to law enforcement. Both had demonstrated violent tendencies. Both had shown no capacity for rehabilitation. And both had been released back into society by a justice system that prioritized second chances over public safety. Eve Carson paid for those second chances with her life. The trial, when it finally came, revealed details that shocked even those who thought they understood the depths of human cruelty. Evidence showed that these men had stalked Eve, that they had watched her apartment, that they had specifically targeted her because she appeared vulnerable, alone, accessible. They chose her the way predators choose prey. And when they discovered she had almost no money, when they realized there was nothing to gain, they killed her anyway. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that in the hours between the abduction and the murder, opportunities existed for these men to release her. They could have taken her car and left her alive. They could have fled with the small amount of cash and possessions they had stolen. Instead, they drove her around for 4 hours, prolonging her terror, before executing her on a residential street as the sun rose. The defense attempted to argue for leniency based on age, on difficult upbringings, on circumstances beyond the defendant's control. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. Both men were found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and multiple other charges. The 17-year-old was tried as an adult. Both received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Both are currently incarcerated in maximum security facilities. Neither has shown remorse. But here is what haunts investigators, what haunts Eve's family, what should haunt all of us. This was preventable. Every single element of this crime was preventable. If the justice system had kept dangerous offenders incarcerated, if parole boards had reviewed records instead of statistics, if public safety had been prioritized over rehabilitation rates, Eve Carson would have graduated in 2009. She would have gone to medical school. She would have saved lives as a doctor, just as she touched lives as a student leader. Instead, she became a statistic, another name on a growing list of victims killed by repeat offenders who should never have been free. And while her killers sit in prison cells, while they eat 3 meals a day and receive health care and have access to education, Eve Carson exists only in memories and photographs, frozen forever at 22, her potential unrealized, her future stolen. The University of North Carolina established a scholarship in Eve's name. Her family created a foundation to support the causes she cared about: homeless outreach, education access, medical research. Thousands of students have benefited from these programs. But no scholarship brings her back. No foundation fills the void she left. Her parents will never see her graduate, never walk her down an aisle, never hold grandchildren who will never be born. The case sparked national conversation about criminal justice reform, about parole systems, about the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. North Carolina reviewed its early release policies. Some changes were made, some protocols were adjusted, but across the country, repeat offenders continue to be released early. Parole boards continue to grant freedom to individuals with violent histories, and families continue to bury loved ones who died because the system failed. This case also exposed something uncomfortable about safety in our modern world. Eve Carson did everything society tells young people to do. She studied hard. She stayed out of trouble. She focused on her future. She was kind, responsible, aware, and none of it mattered. Because evil does not care about your accomplishments. Predators do not respect your potential. And an open door, an uncovered window, a moment of vulnerability, these are all the opportunity that monsters need. In the years since her death, security experts have used this case as a teaching example. The importance of covered windows at night, the danger of open doors, even with screen doors latched, the necessity of awareness, of security cameras, of multiple locks. These are not pleasant lessons. They are not the world we wish we lived in, but they are the reality we must acknowledge. Eve's case also revealed the importance of digital evidence in modern investigations. Without surveillance footage, without ATM cameras, without cell phone records, the timeline of her final hours would remain unknown. Technology captured what human witnesses missed. It created an undeniable record of guilt that no defense attorney could dispute. That evidence ensured justice, even if it came too late to save her life. The community response to Eve's murder was extraordinary. Vigils drew thousands. Memorial services filled stadiums. Students who never met her wore blue ribbons in her honor. The university planted a garden in her memory. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came from the changes her death inspired. Increased campus security, better lighting in student housing areas, education about personal safety. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives. They are Eve's legacy, purchased at the unbearable cost of her own life. If you've watched this far, I need you to understand something. This channel exists to tell stories like Eve's, not for entertainment, but for education, for awareness, for change. Every case we cover represents a real person, a real family, real loss that echoes through generations. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about safety, about justice, about the value of human life, then please subscribe to this channel. Help us reach more people. Help us turn tragedy into awareness. Click that like button, not because you enjoyed hearing about suffering, but because you believe these stories deserve to be told. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a college student who leaves their curtains open at night. Maybe it's a parent who wants to understand the world their children navigate. Maybe it's a voter who needs to know how parole decisions affect real communities. Whatever your reason, sharing this story honors Eve's memory and potentially saves someone else from a similar fate. Now, let me be clear about some practical safety lessons this case teaches us. First, close your curtains at night, especially if you live on a first floor or in an accessible area. Being visible from outside makes you a target. Second, never leave doors open, even with screen doors latched. Screen doors provide no security whatsoever. Third, be aware of your surroundings, particularly during late-night hours. If something feels wrong, trust that instinct. Fourth, vary your routines. Predictability makes you vulnerable. Fifth, ensure someone always knows your schedule and location. Eve's roommate being gone that night meant no one missed her until it was too late. These are not pleasant realities. They represent a world where young women cannot study safely in their own homes, where vigilance becomes necessary for survival. But denying these realities does not make them go away. Acknowledging them, preparing for them, this is how we protect ourselves and those we love. Eve Carson's murder defies human logic because there is no logic in it. $41. That is what her life was worth to her killers. Less than the cost of a textbook, less than a tank of gas, less than a week's worth of coffee. Two men with extensive criminal records, both released early by a system that failed, decided that $41 justified kidnapping, terrorizing, and executing a young woman whose only crime was being visible, accessible, and alone. The question we must ask ourselves is not why this happened. Evil exists. It always has. The question is why we, as a society, continue to create opportunities for evil to act. Why do we release violent offenders early? Why do parole boards prioritize rehabilitation statistics over victim safety? Why do we treat public safety as negotiable? Eve Carson's death demands answers to these questions. Her family deserves those answers. Every potential future victim deserves those answers. This case reminds us that brilliance, kindness, and potential offer no protection against violence. Eve was extraordinary by any measure. She led thousands of students. She volunteered countless hours. She maintained academic excellence while serving her community. And none of it saved her, because the men who killed her did not care about her accomplishments. They saw only opportunity. They saw vulnerability. They saw someone to exploit and destroy. In the end, justice came for Eve's killers. They will die in prison, their lives reduced to concrete cells and locked doors, their futures as empty as the one they stole from her. But that justice feels hollow when we consider what was lost. A doctor who will never heal patients, a leader who will never inspire movements, a daughter who will never come home, a light extinguished before it could shine its brightest. If there is any meaning to be found in this tragedy, it must be in the changes it inspired and the awareness it created. Eve's story has reached millions. It has educated countless people about safety, about justice system failures, about the real cost of soft-on-crime policies. If even one person closes their curtains because of her story, if even one parole board thinks twice before releasing a violent offender, then her death, while senseless and brutal, achieves something beyond mere tragedy. Remember Eve Carson. Remember her not as a victim, but as a young woman full of promise who deserved decades more life. Remember her when you vote for district attorneys and judges. Remember her when you hear about early release programs. Remember her when you consider your own safety choices. Let her story be the one that makes you lock your door, close your curtains, stay aware. Let her legacy be lives saved through lessons learned at the unbearable cost of her own. This is the brutal murder that defies human logic. This is the case that exposes our failures. This is Eve Carson's story, told so that her death might prevent others, so that her light, though extinguished, might still guide us toward a safer, more just world.